because there's a safety bar. Nay, nay. You know why there's a safety bar? Because it ain't safe. And those safety bars aren't big guy friendly. They snap you in half. Oh, yeah, that's real safe. I'll put my balls over here on the platform. I'll pick them up on the ride back. Nay, nay. No, skiing not for me. From now on, they ask me to go skiing. I say nay, nay. And it's no, my friends, my family, they like to do things to me to see what will happen to me. In summertime, the sports, the activities, water skiing, that's another nay, nay. The boat just pulls you. I didn't even stand on the skis. It was like snorkeling underwater really fast. I heard a shark go. What the hell was that? That's a nay, nay. I'll tell you, a big whitewater rafting. What if they give you a little raft? Listen, if it doesn't have a casino and a buffet, it ain't seaworthy. I ain't getting in that thing.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, November the 25th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, and we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Squawk Box, Maria Bartiromo, Israel, and the latest chapter, chapter 18 of Enemies of My Country. All that and more when I come back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
A culture of the casual is a culture of people who already have achieved something and who already can prove it. It is a culture of the static and the settled, the opposite of Tocqueville's restless Americans. Tyler Cowen. Human flourishing never has as its aim the casualness of modern consumer life. It strives for something better, and what is better in the good life is the restless productivity of being adventurous, of being creative, of being ambitious, of being more.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
The right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. The right to a good education. All of these rights spell security, the president said. And after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. America's own rightful place in the world depends in large part upon how fully these and similar rights have been carried into practice for our citizens. Well, those were fighting words to the men and women of my grandfather's generation. The perfect articulation of the progressive agenda and something we've been fighting for ever since. And it all sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? And who could be against good jobs? Putting food on your family, as Bush said, a nice place to live, health care, and education. Who could possibly be against Social Security? Where all this security was going to come from, FDR didn't say. But we, who know the secret code, sure did. From the TAXES of the SUCKERS. In one swift judo move, the president flipped the entire history of the American Republic on its head. A system that was set up to reward risk was now to be repurposed toward ensuring security. A system that, like the men who would soon be storming Omaha Beach, did not have time to mourn a comrade felled by the creative destruction of the hidden hand, would now be repositioned to look backward. The last shall be first. The meek shall inherit the earth, and the productive class shall pay for it. Despite, as Marx might say, all the internal contradictions inherent in our little fairy tales, we somehow got you to believe them. Which is why you're on the verge of selling out more than 2 centuries of your hard-won patrimony for a mess of pottage, while you murmur nervously, like Oliver Twist, "Please, sir, may I have some more?" "We're all socialists now," proclaimed Newsweek in a cover story co-written by Evan Thomas, who totally coincidentally is the grandson of the 6-time socialist candidate for president, Norman Thomas. And if that doesn't say it all, I don't know what does. "You know, Billy, we blew it," says Captain America, Peter Fonda, to Dennis Hopper at the end of Easy Rider. And so you did. For a time there, you had both houses of Congress, the presidency, and a majority of the governorships, and you blew it. You can bet that we won't be making that mistake on our way to fundamentally changing what used to be your country. You should have nuked us when you had the chance. Now, however, our buddies in the press are in trouble. Major newspapers are suffering steep circulation drops or even going out of business entirely. The advertising market has all but evaporated, and free circulation is pretty much the only option left. Mainstream news shows on major networks are shriveling. Much more interesting ways of framing and commenting on the news have appeared, for free, on the internet. And there's always talk radio to turn to when your side has finally had a bellyful of being lectured by our side over the breakfast table. Life in the media bubble has made the members of the mainstream media so crazy that they no longer can distinguish fact from fiction and fantasy from reality. And yet they keep on pushing it like a small child who's been taught that if he just keeps on shouting, he'll eventually get what he wants. Only, it's not working anymore. And this is something that is really distressing us. Which is, of course, the reason we need a return of the fairness doctrine. This internet thing was all well and good when it was our people out in front of it. But lately, I've noticed that you wingnuts have started making a comeback. And worse, are actually developing a following. Some sort of governmental regulation is clearly called for here. Because the last thing that we want is another loose aggregation of pamphleteers springing up, as they did in the mid-18th century, rabble-rousing, destabilizing, creating the conditions for revolution. We've already co-opted your Declaration of Independence with our own form of oligarchy, and are well on the way to having you question, along with us, just about every clause in the Constitution, including the emanations of penumbras, until you no longer believe a single deconstructionist word in it. But we know it's a race against time. The very fact that I'm writing these words ought to clue you in to the desperation we now feel. To have had everything in our grasp, only to watch it slowly slip away as an aroused citizenry casts off its TV-induced torpor and begins to re-engage with its own culture, is just about our worst nightmare. Which is why we'll keep on frantically trying to fool you with outright misstatements and bold lies, with the Real Housewives of Toledo, Ohio, and other mind-numbing, ratiocination-destroying, time-wasting circuses. And when all else fails, and you finally tumble to all the tedious ins and outs of our scam, to please, to demands, to continue to tolerate us for your own good. That's more than Jake Lingle got. Jake wanted to be several things at once, none of them likely to happen on a legman's salary. He wanted to be rich. He wanted to have his counsel listened to at the upper levels of the Florentine court that was Capone Chicago. He wanted to be around the hard men with guns, the men who got their way not through force of argument, but through the cold blue steel of a Colt 38 detective special. Men for whom the thought of violence inspired no counterthought of consequences. Men who acted instead of bloviated. And then, on that fateful day in the underpass, he met one. Thank Gaia that will never happen to us.
And that's the end of Chapter 11 of Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades. 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 20. All retrograde youth opting against the religious life must be raised so as to be disposed to marry as young as possible and to procreate abundantly. Retrogrades should consider this the biological solution to widespread political and moral problems. Radicals are constitutionally sterile and can easily be beaten demographically by the provision of an abundant new retrograde generation in 15 or 20 years. Simply put, we outbreed the radicals. Today's ubiquity of sterility-promoting radical boomerisms embodies the moral decadence presently popular in society. The preponderance of today's culture of death, wait until your 30s philosophy regarding family planning, has yielded small, materialistic families with manufactured, unnatural expectations regarding the amount of wealth required to begin a family. The radical worldview has brainwashed virtually all of society that each and every responsibly birthed newborn requires his own pre-appointed bedroom, cellular data plan, college fund, and career path. Without these already in place before baby's arrival, radical boomerisms instruct us, mother and father are just breeding like rabbits. On the contrary, parents of large families well understand that kids love sharing bedrooms. Smartphone ownership and screen time destroy kids' imaginations and attention spans. College and career should be mapped out not in infancy or elementary school, but rather according to the established merits of middle and high school students. In other words, a man's career and wealth can afford to mature gradually, as his family does. Poverty, not to be confused with destitution, and thrifty living, is good for a love-struck married couple fresh out of high school or college. There is plenty of time for their bank account to develop organically as their family grows. A single newborn baby or two proves remarkably cheap to care for. The radicals, of course, are up against the facts of nature. The likelihood of infertility has almost tripled if a couple waits to conceive until 30 years of age, compared against the same couple's rate at 20 years of age. Science does not lie. The human body's peak fertility occurs at 20 years old for a biological reason. Bear in mind, this is the average age of a college sophomore. If only humanity were to return to a non-manufactured, non-contrived, natural family planning by heeding the anatomical physiological science on this matter, then young men and women would certainly rise to the occasion. Imagine how different a culture of 20-year-old first-time parents would look from a culture of 30-year-old first-timers. Such widespread cultural expectations would be prospective in the sense that teens would customarily make radically different choices in anticipation of real adulthood beginning a decade prior to its present presumed starting point. Arrested development which its perpetual teenagehood would be stopped in its tracks. Retrogrades have been mostly blind to the fact that an aggressive approach to the bio-solution is a guaranteed path to eventual victory over the radicals. Apart from the opportune statecraft implied by the retrograde bio-solution, the benefits which accrue to the young marrieds are plenary. When the sacrament of marriage is practiced properly and timely, men avoid the near certain fate of becoming offbeat, self-obsessed, and lecherous, a fate which awaits perpetually single men as an eventuality. Women avoid the terminus of extended female singlehood, growing shrill, insecure, and officious as they age without a spouse. Women who wed young, virtuous men customarily avoid these vicious qualities of resentment, since they are not habitually looking down their noses upon perverted, morally base husbands who formed lecherous habits in the 20s and 30s. Conversely, when a couple marries young, the man and the woman grow up in the virtues together in the adventurous milieu of the benign financial poverty of youth. Fresh on their journey, the young couple will form good lifelong habits together. Salutary marital habits of teamwork and specialized labor were designed by human biology and the human lifespan to be inculcated in the late teens or early 20s, rather than in the late 20s or early 30s, by which time bad habits have already solidified. A fruit must be picked when it is ripe, not long before or after. Human beings simply aren't open to begin marital teamwork when they get too old. After all, the law of opportunity cost dictates that couples who wait until the 30s to marry may only have so many kids, even if they envision having large families. Having a truly large family mandates an early start. An early start, in turn, mandates purposeful courtship. To initiate courtship, young men should clearly, plainly, directly ask young women for one-on-one dates. The request should be clear, specifically romantic in orientation, and plainly committal. Dinner and a wholesome activity should be expressed as on offer. For their part, young women should clearly, plainly, and directly accept the invitation by young men they are interested in. Just as the offer should be unconditional, so should the young woman's acceptance be. Young women should not request a group hangout, a pre-date coffee or lunch, or any condition precedent to the date. These all constitute breaches of nature. Like matrimony, the first date necessarily involves two and only two people, some calculated risk, unmitigated mutual interest, and mutual commitment. If any of these mitigators appear necessary to the young woman, she should simply and politely decline the young man's invitation. Courtship should last only as long, no longer, as the man reasonably requires in order to discern his compatibility with the woman, and then to tender to her a timely marriage proposal. Such a period of discernment should occupy a varying span of months in duration, not years. As with the first date, the young woman should not condition her proposal acceptance or denial. All her relatives, presumably influenced by boomerisms, will certainly admonish her that she hasn't known him long enough. As noted above, culture of death boomerisms now advise youth to date for the greater part of a decade. If accordingly she feels inclined to request more time, she should simply and graciously reject his proposal. If this rule is followed meticulously, Western dating and marriage will begin to make sense again. A return to classical courtship and prompt marriage will restore the Christian dignity of intersex relations. More importantly still, it will restore sanity to the home and the state.
And that was Rule 20, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Chapter 2. Commandment number 1. Never trust Republicrats. Republicrat, noun, plural being Republicrats. Segment of the American ruling class pretending to be conservatives by paying lip service to conservative principles and camouflaging themselves in patriotic imagery. Often confused with rhinos, Republicans in name only. But Republicrats are far more dangerous because they've learned how to campaign on conservative talking points. Unlike the rhino who campaigns and governs from the middle left, the Republicrat campaigns as a conservative and then governs middle left. Once in office, the record of the Republicrat is virtually indistinguishable from the Democrat, regardless of the campaign rhetoric, either because of cowardice, deception, or a combination of both. Cicero, one of ancient Rome's most famous orators and philosophers, might as well have been talking about Republicrats when he said, quote, "A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves amongst those within the gate freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not a traitor, he speaks in accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face and their arguments. He appeals to their baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation or movement. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of the city. He infects the body politic so it can no longer exist or resist. A murderer is less to fear." Conservatives have spent decades fighting to purge rhinos, Republicans in name only, from the Republican Party, but it turns out the Arlen Specters of the world were little more than a diversion. To a lesser extent, the same could be said of the left. While it is true they would love nothing more than to shred whatever is left of our beloved Constitution and transform our republic into a Western European-style socialist mobocracy, they cannot do it alone. Culprits always need collaborators, especially when they hold minority views in a majority rules country. Twice as many Americans describe themselves as ideologically conservative rather than liberal. 3 times more Americans believe in some variant of the biblical account of creation as the origin of the human species than do atheistic evolution, or that humans evolved from natural means alone. Less than 2% of the American population identifies themselves as homosexual. 74% of Americans want the government to cut deficits. Only 8% of Americans want tax increases to be the focus of deficit reduction, and a majority of Americans favor scrapping the federal income tax altogether. 75% of Americans oppose funding the killing of children with taxpayer dollars. I could continue citing public opinion data that is similarly favorable to conservatives on a wide swath of issues, but by now, you get the picture. Yet, despite widespread public approval for many basic conservative principles, the statists still maintain widespread control of the government schools, the ruling class routinely caves to the moral depravity lobby, the government continues to grow regardless of who's in power, and the child killers at Planned Parenthood continue to pick the taxpayer's pocket. To understand why this is the case, you must first understand the 3 primary languages used in contemporary American politics. The first, and sadly least spoken, is plain English, which is the language spoken by those of us that actually believe the original wording of the Constitution means exactly what it says. Unfortunately, without cultural revival coming soon, this common sense form of expression could become a dead language. The second, and sadly most spoken, is political correctness. This Orwellian doublespeak introduces self-contradictory terms like marriage equality, when any guy that's been married for more than 6 months can tell you there's no such thing, and reproductive freedom, which doesn't make sense since you're killing your reproduction anyway, so why would you want the freedom to reproduce in the first place? This language takes commonly used terms and phrases and strips all common sense from them, thus changing their long-standing and previously acknowledged meanings. For example, tolerance used to mean I put up with you even if I disagree with you because it's a free country. But nowadays, under political correctness, tolerance means you lose your freedom if you don't validate and participate in everything I do that you don't approve of. The third language is a technocratic dialect used only by the Republicrat ruling class. It is meant to throw grassroots conservative patriots off the scent before they realize the Republicans they're supporting are doing practically nothing they were sent there to do. It attempts to convince conservatives that their elected representatives believe in the same plain English they do. However, the group communicating the message means something totally different than those receiving it think/hope they do. So the mind-numbing cliches intentionally get lost in translation. Republicrat lingo is sometimes also referred to as gibberish, jargon, or the crass description for the byproduct of a bull's bowel movement. I have spent years observing Republicrats in their natural habitat in an earnest attempt to make sense of this foul beast wreaking havoc on humanity, not to mention the U.S. Constitution. After much careful study, I believe I finally discovered the Republicrat Rosetta Stone and have cracked their confusing code of complete crap. What I found here is there are 10 phrases used most often by Republicrats. If we can decipher the true meaning of these 10 phrases, unlocking the rest of their sinister secrets instantly becomes much easier. Number 10, something must be done, which really means better to violate our oath of office and betray our base now rather than risk the wrath of the liberal media later. Now, most of the worst ideas in human history begin with cries that something must be done, but when Republicrats utter that phrase, that is a tell they're about to do exactly what the progressive Marxist leftists want them to do. They just need to conjure up a phony crisis in order to justify it. Number 9, Reagan couldn't get nominated today, which really means thank goodness conservatives don't have a real leader like that nowadays to expose our scam. This is a whiny lament frequently utilized by those who either hated Ronald Reagan back in the day or put up with him because he was a winner. Even before he left office, many of these same people systematically went about undoing his legacy in order to maintain their corporatist gravy train. Now that Reagan isn't around to speak for himself, and given the fact conservatives lack leaders with his considerable skills, these political hacks use this line every time. Conservatives demand Republicans act like Republicans and not Democrats. Number 8, leadership. Now, when they say that, that really means surrender to Democrats and liberal media now before it's too late. The Republicrats' primary motivation is to avoid the searing pain of being called nasty names by the liberal media or not being described as reasonable by their Democrat colleagues. So while they use all of our attack words on camera or in press releases, that's really just a signal to the American left they're ready to negotiate the terms of surrender once they've correctly patronized their base with the talking points that gives them the warm fuzzy. Number 7, whenever you hear a Republican say, we need to focus on jobs, that really means, thank goodness the economy sucks, so we have an excuse for standing for nothing. Please note, this self-explanatory Republican mantra is only used when Democrats are in power in any branch of government and does not apply when the Republicans are. When Republicans are in power, substitute any reference to socialism or Jimmy Carter as the appropriate scare tactic for that situation. Number 6, when the Republican says team player, that really means somebody who cares more about being liked, getting their ego stroked, advancing their own ambitions, and or getting a seat at our very wobbly table more than they like taking a righteous stand. The prime directive of the Republican machine is to beget more Republicrats in order to perpetuate their taxpayer-funded fraud. If someone isn't a team player, it's because that person actually got into politics to govern on a set of conservative principles, and they stubbornly insist on sticking to those principles. Therefore, their very existence threatens to expose the entire Republican charade. The Republicrats will typically punish such would-be statesmen by excommunicating said non-team player from all Republican functions and cutting off his access to the campaign purse strings. Better for one principled patriot to die than for their entire scam to perish. Number 5, when you hear a Republican talk about the big tent, know that it really means marginalize conservatives to avoid exposing the fact we're actually embarrassed by the Republican Party platform. Despite all the strategic talk of winning elections, the real reason Republicans seek to bring in those who don't really believe in small government and Judeo-Christian morality is to dilute the influence within the party of those that do. Number 4, when you hear a Republican say the Democrats weren't going to budge, no, that really means we either don't care about your moral convictions or don't share them. Either way, thank the God we constantly patronize with our contrived talking points. We've still got the Democrats around to shift the blame to when we just really want to go home, or living up to our campaign promises to shrink government and defund Planned Parenthood is just too dang hard.
And that was beginning of, he calls it chapter 2, it reads chapter 4 here. Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. A little bit of Squawk Box.
Why do you blame deregulation?
Well, it really comes down to those two words, public policy. When Congress deregulated the airlines in 1978, it said that airlines could fly wherever they want, whenever they want, charge whatever they want. And we took out any of the guardrails that we had from before. And what that means is the airlines now can shrink the size of the seats. They can abandon cities and small towns and rural parts of America. They can make you connect through Dallas or Atlanta or O'Hare. And all these other little miseries that we have, plus a lot of turbulence in the industry itself. When you think about the booms that we've had in the 90s and the 2010s, followed by big busts when demand comes down from 9/11 or COVID, and the airlines come to Congress asking for bailouts and taxpayer support in those cases. So both at the industry level and for individual passengers, I think the experience of flying has gotten to be miserable.
So the first mistake the interviewer makes is not clarifying where this guy stands. Again, he's positioning himself as being neutral. He's not neutral. He has a socio-political ideas. He has socio-political positions that he is pushing through these airlines. Perhaps he's a socialist. Perhaps he is conservative, but she needs to establish his bias right away. But she doesn't do that. So he ends up being able to claim false authority, that he has authority he doesn't really have. And that's one of the hazards of neutrality. Back in a minute. Thank you. Little bit of Maria Bartiromo.
A new Quinnipiac poll finding 45% of young voters ages 18 to 34 believe social media is the reason why our country is so divided. 27% blame cable news. 26% say it's our political leaders' fault. Among all registered voters, 35% say social media is responsible for that division, with political leaders close behind.
No, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong. You're ripping us off because this is fiction. It's a flat-out lie. The fact of the matter is that this is a survey or a poll that was taken, a Quinnipiac poll, university poll. So how many people did they poll? Let's pretend that it was 2,000. We really don't know because you won't tell us. But let's pretend that it was 2,000 people. So what that means is that this is a poll that 45% of the young voters polled say that social media is what's dividing the country. So that means that it's a little under 1,000 people. Let's say just round it out to 900 students. And then as far as the voters, same thing. It's not all voters that say social media. 35% of all voters say social media. It's 35% of those surveyed. So it's an even smaller number. So let's say 500 or 600 or 700 people that say that it is social media that is dividing the country. Who cares? So what? And again, you can do better than this. You must do better than this. You must quit gaslighting, manipulating, ripping off me and the other viewers. Non-profit news now.
Your reaction to these?
I'm also really intrigued by the poll in general, where it's
Thank you. Another thing about the situation in Israel, what just occurred to me is that the other Arab countries, even though they're not, they may not be providing active support to Hamas and Hezbollah, are complicit because they should be hunting down, and should have been over the past 10 years, 20 years, hunting down Hamas and Hezbollah operatives and putting them on trial and putting them in prison when it's called for. Because Hamas and Hezbollah are not just a threat to Israel, they're a threat to the entire Middle East. Nobody in none of the Arab countries want these folks to settle in their countries, because every time they do, there's nothing but violence and revolution in those countries. And so they should be, everybody in the world should be hounding these folks, hunting them down. There should be no safe place for them to go. Qatar has got to be, what a disgusting place. What an absolutely disgusting place when you're allowing two chief Hamas operatives, two of their big shots, to multi-billionaires, to live in your country. You should be arresting them immediately and putting them on trial for war crimes. And the fact that you don't means that hopefully the chickens will come home to roost, that Hamas will create problems for Qatar and its people, and you'll get then Qatar will get what it truly deserves. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the enemies of my country.
18. Sitting without his seatbelt in the lead Land Cruiser's rear passenger seat, Worthy practiced rolling to his left to reach for the pistol on his side. He repeated the maneuver several times without drawing the sidearm, his rifle resting barrel down between his legs. David was seated beside him, pretending not to notice what Worthy was rehearsing as the two-vehicle convoy threaded its way towards Orange, the sun rising over a rolling expanse of desert. After Worthy's final rehearsal found his right palm married to the backstrap of his pistol in a fraction of a second, he relaxed and glanced at the buildings outside, never letting his vision stray far from the front passenger seat. Based on his competitive shooting experience, Worthy was probably faster with a pistol than a rifle. But speed was only one factor in surviving the mission, and the rest, range, power, penetration, made his rifle not only the obvious choice, but the only one. However, when shooting a fellow passenger in the tight confines of the vehicle, a pistol was the only option. With 5 Americans and 2 native Syrians split between 2 land cruisers, David and Cancer had chosen the best load plan possible. A team member drove each vehicle, Ian behind the wheel of Worthy's truck and Cancer driving the trail vehicle, with a Syrian in the passenger seat who could identify anything out of the ordinary and stand at least a chance of talking or bribing their way through any checkpoints they encountered. In the passenger side back seat was another team member who could maintain physical security over the Syrian guide to his front, prepared to react in the event of sabotage. And in the lead truck, that role fell upon Worthy. They could never completely trust anyone outside their own ranks, much less the 2 civilians plucked more or less at random from Syria, a nation with some of the most complex tribal and militant factions on Earth. So a team member had to occupy the Godfather seat behind their Syrian passenger, prepared to react if Elias suddenly grabbed the steering wheel and tried to crash their vehicle, or any such similar nonsense. Worthy's first course of action was physical restraint, threading an arm around Elias's neck and muscling him away from the driver. His pistol was a last resort in more ways than one. If Worthy killed Elias, they'd lose half of their native guides and likely piss off the other half. But Elias had proven to be a model passenger. In fact, he seemed more than enthusiastic about the mission ahead. Elias asked, "So once we get the logistician back to my friend's workshop, what is it you would like to know?" Ian replied from the driver's seat. He facilitated the transport of an ISIS leader and his cargo from your town to an unknown destination earlier this morning. We need to find out the destination. And this ISIS leader is Syrian? Not Syrian, Ian said. He's a foreign fighter. Ah, the scourge of my nation. Where has he slithered in from? Iraq? Lebanon? Palestine? China? Elias considered this a moment. Uyghur or Han Chinese? Uyghur. Thousands of Uyghurs have traveled here. Most fight with the Turkestan Islamic Party, but their allegiance is to Al-Qaeda, not ISIS, and most return to China to fight for a homeland. Only a few hundred choose ISIS and remain in Syria, and these are probably the dumbest of them all. Worthy smiled, wondering who in the hell this guy was. Nizar had been adamant that Elias held a background in Syrian intelligence, leaving his position to resume his childhood trade as a mechanic only when the national situation degraded to the point where he had no choice but to flee Damascus. And Worthy didn't doubt any of that. Elias seemed highly motivated to pursue anyone associated with ISIS and seemed to view the Americans as a welcome, if unexpected, boon to his fortunes. But Worthy sensed the story was incomplete. Elias wasn't being completely open about something, and he hoped to God it wasn't some ulterior motive that would undermine the agency's objective to locate the rockets. Ian said, Well, this guy we're after is definitely leaving the country, and we need to stop that from happening. What has one man done to deserve such attention from America? Ian asked. David? Rather than give permission, David replied to the question himself. He's moving a massive payload of rockets, and it's a safe bet he doesn't plan on leaving them unused. Ah, Elias said knowingly. Yes, this is a problem indeed. But there must be someone else in charge. An ISIS Uyghur would be a foot soldier. Ian said, This one's calling the shots. Trust me. I believe your intelligence is mistaken. Are you familiar with what's going on in Western China? Elias laughed. The same thing that has always happened. China is crushing any dissent under the weight of her massive communist heel. It's more like the Holocaust revisited, Ian said. Between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs have been arrested, thrown aboard trains, and relocated to political re-education camps for no other crime than being born as Turkic Muslims. The abuse at these camps includes executions, forced labor, abortions, and sterilization. The children are being ripped away from their parents and sent to orphanages for indoctrination. It's demographic genocide. Please spare me the lesson. I dare say my country's president has done far worse. Well, someone chose this specific Uyghur man for a reason, and it's not because he's dumb. Add in the fact that the Chinese government carted off his wife and daughter like cattle to slaughter. Imagine how pissed you'd be. And then throw in enough rockets to wipe out downtown Damascus. Now, I don't care if you believe my intelligence or not. We just need to find him, whatever it takes. It sounds like the Chinese should be afraid, not America. Everyone should be afraid, Ian said, until we stop him and recover the rockets. If he can't get them back to China, he'll use them wherever he can. Well, Elias said, this is unusual, but stranger things have happened in Syria. If you people can capture this logistician, I am confident I can obtain the information you require. Worthy noted the eerie silence that followed the end of that particular sentence, but before he could consider the means by which a man like Elias would obtain the information, the men in his truck caught their first glances of the town ahead. Zaranj showed no obvious indications of the Civil War. As the land cruisers made their way through the outskirts, Worthy saw the buildings intact, shops open for business, as men, women, and children roamed the sidewalks freely, most of them in semi-Western clothes. There were no signs of government or militant oppression, and while Worthy's travels abroad had been more limited than anyone on his team, he imagined their current surroundings could have just as easily been in any number of underdeveloped Arab nations that hadn't descended into chaos and militia control. As Ian threaded their way along the route, Elias spoke again. Once we get him, the interrogation may require some unique methods. No torture, David said flatly. I am telling you, Mr. David, it may not be needed. Those with financial motivations will quickly sing. But if he is hardline Islamic State, I will have to encourage him. Then use your head, because you're not hooking up a car battery to some poor bastard's nipples on my watch. Elias recoiled at the accusation. Car battery? What do you take me for? A Frenchman in Algiers? David shrugged. If the shoe fits, perhaps I should simply dress the prisoner in an orange jumpsuit, then waterboard him for my country to prosecute me at some later point. Worthy cringed. Too soon, Elias. Pump the brakes. This only seemed to enrage Elias further. What is the problem? You lose a few thousand in 9/11. Waterboarding is A-okay. No problem, my friend. Syria has lost hundreds of thousands since the start of the war, and Islamic State nearly took over the Middle East. Then Elias clucked his tongue, going silent without immediate response from anyone in the vehicle. David finally spoke in a flat tone. You want to debate geopolitics? Get a side gig as a consultant on C-SPAN once you get back to the States. Until then, watch the road and figure out a way to get our detainee to talk that doesn't involve torture. Elias turned to face forward in the passenger seat, sulking. A friend could at least give me some cigarettes. I have not been able to find Marlboro Reds since Damascus. Worthy said, You should quit. Those things will kill you. If Syria has not killed me yet, perhaps I shall live forever. This comment elicited a half grin from Worthy, an expression that quickly faded as he considered the extent to which his team was operating on a wing and a prayer. Ian had been adamant that short of round-the-clock surveillance on the two flatbed trucks, Bari Khan would find a way to transfer the rockets undetected. Worthy wasn't so sure, but David's ultimate decision had been to remain in the fight however possible. There was a certain logic to his judgment that Worthy couldn't argue. From what David had explained, their agency handler was under incredible scrutiny, to say nothing of the pressure to deliver results. After the team's first outing in the Philippines had suddenly turned into a pilot rescue mission, and the second had seen Bari Khan escape despite a well-laid ambush, they were at risk of total disillusion if they didn't succeed. And while Worthy was no politician, he knew full well that America's foray into a covert targeted killing operation was no small leap. If his team couldn't prove some efficacy in the hours ahead, his country may well abandon the effort for years, if not decades, and more than a few terrorist masterminds would likely rise to power as a result. In the driver's seat, Ian consulted the tablet in his lap before glancing up at the road and then the adjacent buildings. We're almost there. He gave a final glance to his right. That one, blue door. David transmitted to the trail vehicle. Blue door at your 2 o'clock, target building. Cancer replied, Truck 2 copies. Worthy stared out his window, examining the building while keeping his back against the seat so David could see as well. It was a tan, 2-story structure wedged between a similarly unmarked building and an electronics store. Worthy could make out back alleys between and behind the structures, an urban maze that civilians were navigating with ease. David transmitted, addressing Ian and the trail vehicle simultaneously. We're going to do a few passes around the block, case the alleyways before we take it. Cancer confirmed, Easy day, boss. We're ready to drop when you are. They passed the target house, taking in the details of the city block as Ian turned right to loop around it. Worthy felt his senses and instincts satisfied at the sight before him. Unarmed men and women going about their lives, hustling over the sidewalk and across the street as the rhythm of daily life persisted despite the war around them. But when Ian rounded the second corner, Elias spoke urgently. Mr. David, those men do not belong here. Worthy scanned out his window, seeking anything out of place amid the bustling civilians. To him, the scene was indistinguishable from the previous city blocks they'd traveled, and he wondered if Elias was making some play to sabotage the mission ahead. David must have felt the same. Who are you talking about? Blue jacket, white shirt, and the man in the shalwar kameez without a keffiyeh carrying a backpack. There may be more I cannot see. Who are they? Islamic State sleeper cell, Syrian government proxies, who is to say? They will get our man before we can. David said, Ian, get us to the door. Then he keyed his radio and transmitted, Truck 2, Elias sees suspicious military-aged males approaching the target house on foot, likely trying to get the same guy we are. Advancing to breach now, primary plan in effect. Me, Worthy, and Elias will make entry. Riley, you back us up and take control of our prisoner. I want both drivers staying behind the wheel and providing outside security, with Nizar on hand if there's any interference from the locals. Riley will exfil the prisoner to his truck, and then we proceed to Elias's friend's workshop for debrief. In the back seat of the rear truck, Riley felt himself grinning as Cancer keyed his mic in response. Truck 2 copies. Let's hit him. From behind the wheel, Cancer glanced at Riley in the back seat and said, If I gotta stay with the vehicle, you better crack some skulls for me, brother. Riley felt a smug sense of anticipation. It's been 4 days since my last workout. This is going to be fun. That's my boy. Cancer nodded, glancing over to see Nizar looking confused in the passenger seat. What's the matter? You guys don't have roid rage here? No Syrian miscreants on the old gym juice? Nizar said nothing, clearly confused, but having long since resigned himself to letting Cancer say whatever he wanted during the drive into Zaranj. Riley knew he was the ideal choice for manhandling a prisoner. If the slight frames of the Arab men he saw on the streets around him were any indication, he'd have no problem whatsoever in getting their detainee out of the building and into the truck. Armed with the knowledge that said detainee was a supporter, if not an outright member of ISIS, an organization whose calling cards were mass murder and systematic rape, Riley thought that he'd pursue his duties with exceptional vigor. As Cancer wheeled their truck around a street corner and Riley glimpsed the target building, he saw that Elias was already at the door, pounding on it with a fist. David and Worthy stood to either side, weapons pointed down, waiting for the door to open. Then it did, cracking a few inches as Elias took a step backward and David shouldered his way violently through the doorway. Cancer braked to a stop with the words, "Go get him, killer." Riley leapt out of the truck, rifle at the ready as he darted across a short strip of dirt before bursting through the doorway into the ground floor of the building. He brought his rifle up toward 3 figures, none of them his teammates. Then he lowered his barrel as quickly as he'd taken aim. The trio of young teenage women were holding up their hands in submission, making no attempt to defend the man of the house. But these girls were too similar in age to be daughters, and Riley realized they were the man's wives, if you could call them that. More likely, ISIS war brides provided in exchange for services rendered. Oh, Riley thought with a darkening sense of anger, he was going to manhandle this prisoner far more than necessary in the course of his duties. From the far side of a doorway, he heard David shouting, "Doc, in here!" Riley rushed forward, clearing the next doorway and entering an empty kitchen. The next door he encountered was open, and he jogged through it toward the sounds of men grunting in exertion. But when he rounded the corner to see Elias standing triumphantly over David, who had his knee in the prostrate prisoner's back as Ian applied flex cuffs, Riley stopped short. David said, "Doc, come get this guy." Elias waved a hand between Riley and the prisoner, looking inconvenienced. "What is the problem? Pick him up." But the prisoner that David was in the process of flex cuffing was a bloated mess of a man, probably 230 pounds and very little of it muscle mass. Gritting his teeth, Riley stomped over and prepared to deadlift his prisoner. That effort took more strain than he anticipated, even with David and Ian trying to help him. As Riley hoisted the prisoner upright, the man spat into David's eyes. David responded in kind, driving a fist across the prisoner's face and causing the fat man to go limp in Riley's grasp. He struggled to catch the logistician. "Suicide? You're not helping." "Sorry," David said, wiping his eyes clear. "Let's go." The detainee was shouting in Arabic, presumably insults, judging by the tone, and did his best to resist the transport, locking his knees and trying to halt forward progress more than his considerable weight already was. Riley assisted his captive's motivation to comply by swinging him sideways, then flinging him into the wall. The man's forehead cracked off the surface, driving his body backward into Riley's grasp, and he exploited the gap in resistance by half pushing, half dragging the prisoner into the front room. And that, he soon found, was where things got complicated. The 3 teenage women who'd formerly cowed before Riley's barrel had undergone some critical metamorphosis upon seeing their husband/rapist being dragged out of the building. They descended upon the prisoner with shouts and cries, assaulting him with their words and their fists as David and Ian struggled to keep them at bay. But one particularly emboldened young woman broke free of David's arms, advanced before she could be grabbed again, and drove a kick to the prisoner's groin with a force that defied comprehension. The big man went limp once again. Riley had to squat down to support the weight, wheeling the man away from his former captives and toward the door to the street. And whatever Elias's intuition about suspicious men approaching the target building, Riley saw in a glance that he'd been correct. David and Worthy had their barrels raised, firing their first suppressed rounds at targets to their left. A collective scream erupted from the civilians around them as men and women darted for cover. Then Riley caught his first sight of an enemy combatant, a man running across the street toward him, drawing a pistol from beneath his shirt. Riley's only possible reaction was to throw his detainee to the ground, draw his rifle, and shoot the man that David and Worthy were too preoccupied to see. But by the time he did, Riley knew it would be too late. Just as he prepared to drop his prisoner, he saw that he didn't have to. Cancer's silver Land Cruiser roared down the street, mowing down the pistol-wielding man beneath the bumper before screeching to a halt. Then Cancer shifted to reverse, flooring the gas to back over the fallen enemy for good measure. All of this occurred in Riley's first 6 seconds outside the building, a surreal melee of violence that could have just as easily been dismissed as a bizarre dream. David and Worthy fired as fast as they could at the men closing in on the target house from all directions, and Riley heard a single shouted order from his team leader. "Get him off the street!" Riley turned to see a storefront door beside him and manhandled his prisoner sideways for 3 staggering steps. Then, mustering all of his strength, Riley swung the man to his right and hurled him into the door, which burst open as he landed on his stomach with a cry of pain. Riley turned to provide suppressing fire, finding and then engaging a man crouched behind a parked car, his rifle angled over the hood. Firing 2 shots, Riley saw the man drop out of sight before he swung his barrel to the right, blasting a half-dozen rounds at a building corner where he'd seen a flash of gunfire. He continued shooting at another enemy sprinting into view, his peripheral vision registering 3 figures racing behind him to enter the store through the now open doorway. First Worthy, then Elias, and finally David. As David opened fire from the shop window, Riley turned to plunge inside and saw the chaos within. It was a small electronics store, the walls filled with cheap cell phones and wire attachments, and the owner behind the counter was red-faced, wild-eyed, and screaming at them in incomprehensible rapid-fire Arabic. "This way!" Elias shouted, waving Riley into a back room. Flinging his rifle behind him on its sling, Riley squatted above his prisoner, still in the prone amid shattered glass, and deadlifted him upright. The prisoner was disoriented but still able to resist. He dug in his heels, writhing his shoulders against Riley's grasp. "You dumb son of a bitch," Riley grunted, swinging the man's massive body to his left. The prisoner's head smashed into the corner of a display case, buying Riley a few moments to hoist his cargo through the doorway after Elias. Beyond was a small storage room with a single exit into an alley. Devoid of options, Riley hauled the logistician's mass through the next door, emerging into the alley and following Worthy and Elias toward a side street. David was behind him, transmitting over the team frequency, though Riley couldn't make out the voice in his earpiece over the shouts of civilians and enemy alike. Instead, he followed the men to his front, fully aware that he was the only team member capable of hauling the ISIS logistician's obese figure toward some unknown exfil, and trusting Worthy and David to manage the tactical situation with Elias's help. And while his trust in his teammates was absolute, it was Elias who represented the single point of failure for this operation. Any lingering doubts faded when the combined element reached the side street ahead. Cancer's Land Cruiser fishtailed to a stop before them, and Elias ripped open the back door as Riley charged forward with his unrepentant cargo. Riley's next movement was performed with all the unceremonious grace with which he struggled through repetitions in the gym under enormous resistance. He took a final pair of staggering steps, squatted beneath the weight of his load, and with as much force as he could muster, hurled the prisoner into the back seat. The logistician's body sailed forward, achieving not any great distance, but sufficient to cause his head to impact the far door so hard that Riley feared he'd just broken the man's neck. There was no time to confirm. Riley leapt atop the back seat, feeling Cancer accelerate before he could close the door. Glancing through the rear windshield, Riley saw David, Worthy, and Elias leaping inside Ian's waiting truck, and together, the two vehicles sped toward the workshop.
And that was Chapter 18 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.